Alright. Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got a couple bins, a couple of 222-day-old nightcrawler bins, not European nightcrawlers as I originally wrote on here. They're actually African nightcrawler bins. And these systems were last fed 12 days ago with some interesting apple and kind of a cake, pastry sort of a thing. And I was curious to see how that pastry's coming along 12 days later, whether it's been eaten, whether it just sat there and maybe turned to mold. A lot of times when I feed a bread sort of a substance, it turns to mold unless it's really, really damp. So I don't know what to expect of that stuff, but whether or not there's leftovers of that last feeding, I'm not too worried. I bought down more food for them. I've got some pumpkin and some potato peels to give to them. And since that last pastry feeding was feeding number 20, this will be feeding number 21. So I'm going to get a glove on, and we're going to get those two bins, the ones that are down there at the bottom, lower left. We're going to get them up on the bench and get them fed. So let's get to work. So this is the bin that was labeled as bin number 1. And as you can probably imagine, the reason the plastic was not spread out across the entire top surface, it was because we sensed that there might have been a little bit of excess moisture in here, and that's the reason we thought that perhaps leaving it to get a little bit of airflow and allow for a little bit of drying around the edges, we might be able to get things back to a more normal state. Since the other one was left pretty much fully covered, I assume that once we get into there, we'll find that the level of the moisture was probably okay. It's kind of interesting, since this coffee filter, which is my way of indicating where we last fed, is right in the middle here. You would normally think that the middle section of the bin is where you'd have kind of a divot as a indicator of the food and bedding that had been eaten, causing it to collapse down the middle a little bit, but here I'm actually seeing a little bit of a mound in the middle, so it might just be the way we left it last time. Generally I try to level things off, and then I kind of use that depression that I observe in the very beginning as an indicator to give me an early warning as to what to expect in terms of how they did on the last feeding. So right here at the top surface, I'm already seeing some of the stuff that would have been put back into the system as leftovers. Usually we kind of pick through and we try to see how they're doing on the food that's left over from previous feedings. Like this, for example, appears to me like the stem of a banana, what's left of it, and there's not a whole lot left of it. It's really falling to pieces at this point. So anything that has that sort of appearance to it, usually to me, is possibly a banana stem. And then sometimes you see something that's just so worn that you can't even really tell what it is, but it's also very fibrous and strandy. So it might also be some sort of a banana peel. Another one. I almost bought down a couple more banana peels for them, but I opted for the pumpkin and the potato peels to give them this time. So let's do something really quick here. We're going to gather up this somewhat drier material that's around the outer edges where the plastic was not covering things. So I do want to make sure all this stuff that's been left to dry all ends up down underneath the surface to get rehydrated and put it all back into service, so to speak. Because otherwise, being as dry as it is, it could just remain that way if we don't take active measures to try to get it back into action. And I'm assuming that we're not going to need to continue drying things here. Usually if you leave portion of your bin to dry off to a certain degree over a couple weeks time, then things kind of shape up pretty good. And I don't know what this is. Such a huge long stem of something. Some sort of an organic piece of material, but something this long would have typically been something that I would have known what it was and I'd be able to identify it later. I mean, even here you got these massive stems of leaves. These are clearly the stems of leaves, but what that other thing was, I don't know for sure. So let's just go ahead. I mean, I know that I didn't include a lot of leaves, so this might have just been some sort of a stick that ended up in here with the leaves that I put in here last time. we've got ourselves a nice little collection of stuff that we can place right in underneath the feeding, and since the feeding includes all that pumpkin that I'm going to be giving them, I think that pumpkin's going to bring with it a good bit of moisture. The potato peels perhaps not quite so much. Well, I guess I'm not really noticing anything that appears like leftovers of pastry, but maybe we've just not gone down deep enough. Maybe that's what we're starting to see signs of down here. When I put things like noodles or bread or pastry or cereals or grains even, sometimes they do sometimes just look like mush after a while. So the worms might be working the stuff down, but it might also just be sitting here idle, waiting to get to the point where the worms can actually move in and start taking advantage of it. But I'm not worried. I'm not put off by finding leftovers. In fact, sometimes finding the leftovers even reinforces in my mind that giving them more food now is probably a good idea, because perhaps the stuff I gave them last time is just a type of food that's going to take them a long time to be able to start working on it. Maybe it's just not at that stage of decomposition yet that the worms are able to utilize it as a food source. So that might just be the case with those bits of pastry they got last time. You can also see a lot of the leaves that were sprinkled down into the feeding area as part of their bedding that went in with the food. Yeah, this to me looks like just another big lump of pastry. So let's just keep it all kind of together, and then as we sprinkle it back into the feeding area, we'll try to do so in a way that kind of breaks it up into smaller little chunks and spreads it around. And hopefully by the next time we get in here, we won't see much, if any, of it left over. Now we're definitely getting down into the section where there's a lot of worms hanging out, and I can even feel a little bit of warmth down here, oddly enough. This looks to me like more leftover pastry. I mean, after 12 days since we put fresh food in here and bedding, it seems very unlikely that the warmth I'm feeling would be sort of a hot composting action occurring in here. I would typically just kind of chalk that up to probably just being a large number of worms that I had just sort of, run my hands through. So I'm guessing that that's what I felt there was. The warmth was probably just a bunch of worms. These are banana stems too, but the kind that are kind of stuck together. I forget, one of my viewers, I think, even told me the actual specific names of the different things. A hand of bananas, and then each stem of a banana is a finger or something like that. I remember there was some sort of an analogy to a hand. So here's banana peel. This was the stem of a pumpkin, by the way, making some pretty good progress. And there's more leftovers down here, more pastry, I believe. The stuff has definitely got worms surrounding it, so I'm not worried that the worms don't like it. My only concern is that it might just be in kind of big lumps or chunks that are just too big for the worms to be able to take fully advantage of. So that I think, possibly breaking the stuff up into smaller fragments would be the key to getting more worms, easier access to more of it, so that by the next time we come in here, we see possibly no more of it as leftovers in here. So you can see there's a good number of worms in here. I hit certain little pockets of them here and there. And within a minute or two, they're all going to scurry out of view, because they don't like being out here in the bright lights, that's for sure. I believe we've made a large enough crevice down here in the middle to plop their feeding into today. I think since there's so much leafy matter in here that was part of the last feeding, it might not be necessary to add bedding today. So why don't we just use all this dry stuff that we collected in the beginning as sort of the foundation for today's feeding. Get it right down into the section where all that pumpkin, as it thaws, is going to release its juices into it. Getting it all moist and juicy again so the worms can start working on that stuff once again. And then I guess we'll do a quick exploration of the other sections of the bin that we've not yet checked out on the outer edges out here, just to see how moisture's doing. But I would assume that since we had things relatively uncovered here, we're probably going to find that things are not quite as damp as they were when we were last in here. So here I am kind of putting worms right down into the spot where I'm going to be putting the frozen pumpkin and frozen potato peels. So maybe the first thing I'll do is I'll just sprinkle the coffee in here first, which is at room temperature, so that when the cold stuff comes in right after, we don't inconvenience any of these little worms that are down here in the feeding area with the shot of cold coming in on top of them. I mean, and they'll feel the cold just beyond the coffee insulation layer, but at least they won't have frozen stuff hitting them directly. And this coffee's been sitting around for a while, as you can see. Some of it over here, the older stuff, it's got some nice mold developing on it already. That's all stuff the worms are really going to like, I believe. Another thing I usually like to do is try to include a little bit of worm chow with my coffee. I've got very little left here, so I'm going to attempt to divvy it up between these two systems evenly, and then I'll be needing to get to work on making a little bit more of that stuff to support future worm bin feeding. So let's see if we can give these guys half of these bits of pumpkin here, save the rest for the other system that we're going to feed, and then same thing goes with the potato peel. I think we'll set the rest of it aside, save it for the other system. Make sure we give an even amount to both systems. Not that anyone's keeping track per se, but I just like to try to be consistent. And I think that should be a nice feeding for these little guys. They've got leftover pastry. It all went right back in to the feeding zone, and then they've got a bunch of fresh stuff, which is foods that I believe are going to go quite quickly. I know that the pumpkin's almost guaranteed to go quickly, and I've always found that the potato peels, when I put them in, as long as they've been frozen first, get really mushy as they thaw, and then the worms are able to move right in and nibble that stuff down, right down to the peel. So any little fragments of potato still stuck to these pieces of potato peel are going to go, and then the potato peel itself will get eaten as well. But the actual potato stuck to the skins is going to go rather quickly, I believe. So as I was excavating there, I was trying to gauge the moisture level. It did seem to me like there was nothing in here that seemed overly damp. This is unusual. A little piece of plastic. I always wonder how stuff like this ends up in here, and I usually assume it's coming in with my leaves that I bring from outside, because that stuff I don't really go through very thoroughly. The leaf vac, or the leaf blower that I have, serves also as a vacuum. It sucks stuff up pretty indiscriminately, and then I end up with who knows what in my collections of leaves. And then even when I'm applying the leaves to my worm bins, I'm not picking through the stuff to check it all out as it goes into the bins. So sometimes I need to pull out little bits of debris that aren't really meant to go into the worm bins, especially those things that just aren't going to ever break down. Other things that come in with the leaves are sometimes sticks and branches, which I guess they would break down over time, a tremendously long period of time. But those things I typically pull out too, thinking that, they're just going to take way too long, and I'd prefer not to wait. Rather just see the stuff go. Well, that was a pretty cool feeding. Lots of worms hanging out down there. Hopefully enjoying the pastry. Even though there was a lot of leftover, I did see worms surrounding this stuff. Almost every time I found a nice big bunch of worms, there was a little chunk of pastry nearby. Since that pastry had apple on it, maybe it was the apple that they were enjoying. It's hard to say. Who knows? Maybe it wasn't even the pastry or the apple. Maybe it was just the mold that was beginning to grow on this stuff. So I like the moisture level in here now. We've taken the more dry stuff and submerged it down deep and tilled up the rest of this stuff in here. And I think we've now got a moisture level in here that's a little bit more like what I like to see, And I guess for me the gauge is just generally how easily the stuff crumbles. All right, very nice. Let's get the other bin out here and get them fed. Here we go, bin number 2, and much the same. The only difference is that this is a somewhat smaller, not by much, just a little bit smaller container. I think the only real difference is the dimension across here. The other bin was just a slightly bit wider, and that's probably the reason these 2 plastic bags are the same type of bag, but this one actually does reach both edges going across, while on the other system, in that slightly wider bin, the plastic just does not reach all the way across. It almost does appear to me like these top covering pieces of newspaper might actually last one more round. I mean, in the other system they were quite intact. This piece over here is really intact. Just this one, for whatever reason, does seem like it received a good bit of wear, but guess what? We're gonna give it one more chance to serve active duty, and then next time we'll probably end up swapping those things out, because I doubt they'll be in that kind of shape anymore next time. They'll probably be much further along. And you can really see the difference, you know, when a system's fully covered like this one is, the material all the way out to the edges is all damp. And as long as the material's damp, the worms are going to keep working it. It's just that when the stuff dries out, that's when the worms are just really unable to come in and spend time there. They really do need to sort of keep their distance. I'm almost curious at this point just to do a little bit of a test to sort of probe down in here with my fingers, and yeah, I definitely feel warmth, and I do wonder if it's sort of a composting activity or just, you know, a bacterial breakdown of the foods I added most recently causing that temperature increase, or is it just a bunch of worms kind of rubbing up against each other, and maybe it's body heat that I'm sensing, I don't know. So in the other bin we had a pretty good sized chunk of pumpkin stem, and here we've got a pretty small fragment of pumpkin stem, which probably means there's other pieces of this same pumpkin stem floating around nearby. This is corn cob, and I got a feeling we're probably going to find similar leftovers of the pastry, pretty good sized chunks of it scattered throughout the feeding area. Once again, I'd really like to try to get that stuff spread out throughout the feeding area so that it's up against all the yummy pumpkin and yummy potato peels we're going to be adding in here today, so that hopefully they can knock that stuff out too. And it does seem to me like they're actually going for this stuff, but it might have only just started recently, you know. The stuff might have been kind of, who knows, might have preservatives in it or whatever, but you could see mold starting to make its way onto this stuff here. You could see worms hanging out in it, but since it's a pretty good sized lump of material, its insides don't get any attention, obviously. Or maybe not so obviously, but yeah, that's the case. When you got a big lump of something, the worms can easily access its outer surface, its exposed surface, but its inner core is basically shielded from worm activity by the outer layer of material, so a lot of times I do feel compelled to try breaking stuff like that up a little bit to give all of the material fair access to worm traffic. But then again, there's other things I like to leave alone, you know, like these corn cobs. I know that if I broke that, we would see the inside and we would see that it's mobbed with worms on the inside. But for whatever reason, I just like to leave the corn cobs to break down on their own, because I guess part of the reason is because they are such a slow composting food that it just is sometimes a little bit surprising to see how long they're lasting without any help. Alright, so oh my goodness. Let's just continue with trying to get this feeding zone excavated. I guess I'm only picking through a little bit here because I am trying to see how the leftover pastry bits are holding up, so I'm trying to pick them out as I go, so that perhaps as I return them, look at this. This is just a big huge pile of worms surrounding something, and whatever it was has been turned to castings, because right in the middle of that wad of worms was just a pile of castings. So I somehow doubt that it would have been that pastry. Whatever it was, though, they were really enjoying it. It does seem like they did away with it for the most part, too. So we've got a variety of leftovers here. You know, not only the pastry that was added in here only last time, but corn cobs, which go way back. Way back. I only found one fragment of pumpkin stem, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's more chunks of it in here. We might even bump into it eventually, but at this point I think we've made a large enough pit to drop today's feeding into. I guess the only regret I have is that I wasn't really going to add any bedding with today's feeding. I just figured I'd add food only. So, you know, I guess just for the sake of consistency, I think I will just stick to that plan of not adding any bedding today. I see tons of leftover leaves from the last time, so I think they're good from that point of view. So let's do the same thing we did before, though. Let's give the worms on the very surface here, down in our feeding zone, a little protection from the cold that's going to come in. And then I also like to include the worm chow with the coffee, but that's it for my supply of worm chow now. So I'll definitely be making more. And now onto this layer of room temperature coffee and worm chow. We can plop in the frozen stuff without any impact to our conscience. Not that I think it's going to really harm the worms too much if they bump up to something that's a little bit frozen and frosty. I'm fairly confident that they'd have no problem getting away from this stuff. So into the frozen stuff, I guess, comes some of these leftover bits, which do have worms hanging out in them. So it's not a perfect solution that I came up with here, trying to keep the worms protected from the cold stuff. But I guess maybe I get a B or a C for effort. Definitely not getting an A for effort, because I was pretty weak. But I think we've more or less returned all the stuff that we've found as leftovers, at least for the most part, back down into the hot zone, back down into the feeding area. And once again, I always, not always, but you know, I do attempt to remind myself that a quick check on the system's outskirts is usually a good idea. Sometimes I do forget, so sometimes the systems might go a feeding or two, or maybe 2 or 3 without me checking the outskirts. But I've been pretty good lately reminding myself to make sure that I verify everything on the outskirts is in good shape, because you know, if I'm feeding down the middle, which is what I normally do lately, that area in the bin is going to get examined for certain as we apply the food. But the outskirts, unless I tell myself to go in there and check, I could sometimes go multiple feedings, which adds up to many weeks, without confirming the outskirts of the bin as being in good shape, and sometimes I worry, you know. But luckily everything looks really good. The material's damp, and even though it's damp, it crumbles, and just the presence of a whole bunch of worms in it also, to me, usually comes across as an indicator of things being in good shape. So I think we've got ourselves a couple of really nice African nightcrawler bins here. Not European nightcrawler bins, African nightcrawler bins. Although, you know, these are the African nightcrawlers that I received originally as cocoons from the crazy worm lady from Emily all those years ago. And even from the very beginning, I wasn't very mindful of keeping the cocoons isolated from other types of worm cocoons. And then even later, just, you know, the bins being out on my shelves where possibly other types of worms from bins above could crawl out and drop in and mix the population. So a lot of times I do wonder if what I've got here are truly African nightcrawlers. But hey, you know, until I am told conclusively otherwise, I'm going to tend to just keep calling them African nightcrawlers. Alright everyone, that was fun. That's our quick check-in here today with these African nightcrawlers getting a nice little follow-up to their pastry feeding number 21 on day 222. And I think these systems are doing great. I got a couple things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away. I'm not going to waste your time with that though. Really quick though, before I go, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.